welcome each one of you to this evening's presentation with Spencer Fernando. Thank you for joining us. We trust that you've had a good summer and we're able to enjoy, especially of late, some lovely weather. We want to also make a point of thanking you for your ongoing support of Freedom Defence Canada. As you know, Freedom Defence Canada exists to educate and inform Canadians about the changes that are taking place in our society, and furthermore, to motivate people to action in terms of being involved in the culture, both politically and in other venues. We want to encourage membership and thank you for being members. Your membership and the donations that you provide allow us to host excellent speakers like we have tonight. Also to maintain a website with timely articles, videos, as well as a lot of archived material. We also have a social media presence, particularly on Facebook, and it also allows us to pursue other avenues for informing and training members. So we thank you for supporting us. Thank you for your ongoing support in terms of providing those things for us as an organization. As you know, we are clearly in a cultural war where the good and godly foundations of the West are being attacked and destroyed by those who hate Western civilization. Standing together to encourage and help one another in this struggle for what is right is why Freedom Defence Canada exists. So thank you again for supporting us. And we encourage you to encourage your family and friends to join us and support this ongoing work. So thank you for that. Now I will hand it back to Perry for further instructions prior to introducing our guest speaker.
Thank you, Mike. And once again, thank you, Spencer, for giving this presentation to us tonight. So I just want to introduce myself. Most of you already know me. My name is Perry Foster. I'm the Communications Director for Freedom Defence Canada. And as some of you also know from having gone to previous events, I'll be managing the event tonight. So we ask you, if your mic is not muted, to mute it before the presentation and during, because that's the best way to maintain a good atmosphere of respect. After Spencer has finished his presentation, we're going to have a question and answer session. I'll explain the details of how that will work when the time comes. And so think of the questions you might want to ask him. Spencer has a wealth of knowledge and talent, and we should definitely be taking advantage of his perspective and understanding it. So I'll shift back to you, Mike.
Okay. And I apologize for not introducing myself. I forgot that I'm not as known a quantity as our former chairman was. That was Reed Ellie, of course. So my name is Mike Grindelwald, and I am the fairly new chair of Freedom Defence Canada. So that little oversight hopefully is corrected. It is my privilege to introduce to you this evening Spencer Fernando. He is a man that is likely familiar to some of you as we had him some years ago at Duncan Meadows Golf and Country Club at an event that, if I remember right, it was even on your honeymoon, Spencer, of all things.
That's right.
So that shows a level of commitment that I think very few of us can actually ride. So we'll leave that with you. Since that time, Spencer has gained a significant following on social media as an independent Canadian journalist and writer. Spencer is also a campaign fellow for the National Citizens Coalition, and on his own website, alongside his daily articles, which are excellent. I read them quite voraciously. Spencer has also recently begun a new feature, a relatively new feature, which is an in-depth analysis of the issues facing our nation today. His experience and extensive knowledge of politics and journalism, alongside his willingness to stand up for freedom, has garnered for Spencer a large and growing following across Canada. So Spencer, without further ado, thank you for joining us today. And I will pass it over to you. And if there's more you'd like to share about yourself and the work you're doing, please feel free to do that. But I'll give it over to you and you can introduce the topic as well. So Spencer, thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor to be here today, and it's really a very interesting, moment in the future of our country. I'm going to be talking about the restoration of Canada's freedoms, and I think it's a time where the country can really either go one of two ways, and I think that's what we're going to talk about today. But it's a very stark choice that we're facing, and it's not going to be easy, I think, to get to the restoration of our freedoms, because there are a lot of people who have a vested interest in making sure nothing changes. And that's really the start of my presentation. Is before discussing how we can restore our freedoms in Canada, we do have to note that many of the people at the top of the power structure in the country, including the Liberal NDP Socialist Coalition, much of the establishment media, they don't even believe any freedoms have been lost. Or if they do believe freedoms have been lost, they're happy about it. They seem completely unconcerned with what millions of Canadians have been going through over the past 2.5 years. And they're unconcerned about the demonization of so many of our fellow citizens that has led to the anger and division we see across the country. So when they ask, what freedoms have been lost, or when they claim that freedom itself is some sort of niche issue, they demonstrate the mindset that we need to overcome in this country. Of course, I don't have to tell you this, but at various times over the past 2.5 years, Canadians have lost the right to gather with their families, lost the right to gather together to worship, lost the right to travel, lost the right to leave our homes past certain times in the evening, lost the right to run a business, lost the right to see family members in nursing homes, lost the right to attend funerals of our loved ones, lost the right to even gather together outside in some instances, and lost the right to make our own medical decisions. Nearly every right that we take for granted was really at one time or another taken away from millions of us over the past 2.5 years. And the fact that we have some of those rights temporarily returned doesn't change the fact that those rights have really been revealed not to be rights at all, but merely privileges that can be easily revoked on the whim of a politician. All the while, it was clear that political calculation and rampant hypocrisy was behind much of this. We remember when we were all told, very strictly to stay home and save lives. And then there was a Black Lives Matter protest, and all of a sudden there was an exception that politicians like Justin Trudeau gladly exploited. At that moment, it should have been clear to all Canadians what this was really about: asserting control, utilizing fear, and testing how much authoritarianism Canadians would put up with. Well, as a nation, we obviously put up with far too much. Our power-hungry leaders have certainly taken notice of this, and they will not hesitate to ramp up fear in pursuit of their future plans. And this brings us to the main point that I want to discuss today. While much of the focus regarding the future of Canada is understandably about policy and the personality of party leaders, the deeper battle is a mental one. And in fact, I believe that what we're seeing in this country is a psychological revolution, a profound shift in the mindset of millions of Canadians. This shift is incomplete, and there is an ongoing effort to reverse it, but it is proving to be the key factor underpinning everything we see happening around us. How the psychological revolution plays out will determine whether or not we can restore Canada's freedoms, or whether our country will succumb to the authoritarian impulse. Now, to start with, we have to consider the pre-existing mindset of many people in this country. The pandemic and the reaction to it demonstrated that many Canadians will allow fear to push them into an authoritarian state of mind. Knowing this, governments led by people like Justin Trudeau, someone who has openly praised communist authoritarian regimes, were keen to generate a fearful mindset so as to prime citizens for policies that take away their rights. The mindset preceded the policy, and that is an essential point to remember. Governments across the country, led by the Trudeau government federally, matched the fearful mindset with the already present stereotype of Canadian niceness. They took advantage of the fact that many Canadians feel a sense of submission to authority and felt that by listening to the government, they were just doing their part. As with everything else, positive traits can easily become negative traits when they're taken to an extreme. And a desire to be nice and avoid conflict can easily become submissiveness and a willingness to be mistreated. It's no coincidence that Canada has both a reputation for being such a nice place, while we also ended up putting up with some of the most draconian restrictions in the world. Now, I emphasize the word nice here because I think it's very different than being kind. There's an almost a weakness to the word nice, because we do often see that the nicest people are the ones who don't have the capacity for anything else and who couldn't handle conflict even when it is necessary. Niceness is often a way for people to hide their anger and put on a facade, and we see this as many of the nicest Canadians were quite glad to demonize unvaccinated people, often in quite brutal and heartless ways. For a long time during the pandemic, this mindset went largely unchallenged. It was dominant throughout the country, and it came very close to achieving a complete victory. Remember, the Conservative Party of Canada very nearly submitted themselves to the authoritarian big government agenda of the Liberals and the NDP, something that was only avoided by an internal revolt. And that revolt was itself caused by the psychological revolution we're discussing today. So what is that revolution? Why is it happening? And what does it mean for our future? To answer those questions, we have to start with where it began. It's tempting to see the Freedom Convoy as the beginning of this shift. But the fact that the Freedom Convoy garnered so much support among Canadians demonstrates the real shift in the mindset of millions of people was already taking place. As the federal government became more and more authoritarian, and as more and more freedoms were taken away and turned into privileges, many Canadians started to question whether this was really the country we wanted to be. How could we reconcile our perceived niceness with front pages like we saw in the Toronto Star that included horrendous comments about unvaccinated people, including one that said, "Let them die"? Why was the science always what seemed to be most politically expedient for the government? Why was Justin Trudeau allowed to shift from saying Canada wasn't a country that mandated vaccination to pushing for vaccine mandates and vaccine passports to try and win an election? Why did the media spend more time hounding business owners trying to keep their livelihoods going than confronting politicians who kept getting paid and kept giving themselves raises throughout the pandemic? And why did nearly every major institution and center of power jump on board the fear-based, ask no questions, do what the government tells you narrative? As always, every action leads to a reaction. And watching so many Canadians submit to fear and government power pushed many to do the exact opposite. So all of this was really bubbling under the surface. The leadership of the Conservative Party at the time was spending most of their efforts trying to discourage their own supporters and their own MPs from speaking out against draconian government policies. So the opposition had to be expressed elsewhere. Through independent media and through Canadians sharing their thoughts on social media, and even in some of the polls that started to show the beginning of a shift in attitudes, it was clear that whatever consensus existed for Canada's radical authoritarian shift was beginning to break down. But it took the Trudeau government imposing a vaccine mandate on truckers that finally tipped a critical mass of people from private opposition to the government towards public opposition. The vaccine mandate on truckers was so obviously a vindictive policy, and so obviously an attempt to keep Canadians locked into a fear-based mindset, that it became impossible for people to avoid what was right in front of their own eyes. The Trudeau government was never going to give up their newfound power unless heavily pressured to do so. And since the Conservative Party was still too scared to push back in any real way, Canadians pushed back ourselves. And that is the real beginning of the public manifestation of the profound psychological shift that we are seeing. A critical mass of Canadians decided that the time for being nice and submissive was over. People decided that instead of waiting for a politician to take action, instead of waiting for someone else to take action, we would take action. In massive numbers, Canadians took to the roads, either in the convoy itself or to express support, and contributed to the convoy in a massive grassroots effort. This was quite a shock to the power structure because the Liberal government and the establishment press didn't really know how to deal with a whole bunch of Canadians finally standing up and saying, "Enough is enough." Just look at the bewildered and fearful response by the government at the time. Trudeau started off saying the convoy was just a small fringe, and government officials arrogantly downplayed it, only to move in a few weeks to claiming it was a massive national crisis. They then seized even more power by abusing the Emergencies Act. And this was also instructive. A key argument of the Freedom Convoy and a key tenet of the psychological shift among millions of Canadians was that the Trudeau government had become authoritarian and would always exploit every opportunity to expand their own power. By abusing the Emergencies Act, Justin Trudeau confirmed this. He reacted exactly as an authoritarian would be expected to react. And the media often did the same, spending much of their time pushing government narratives on the convoy and demonizing convoy participants as racists, bigots, extremists, and whatever other insults they could find. Interestingly, this coincided with a massive surge in support for independent media personalities, many of whom saw a massive surge in followers and support online. This again demonstrated the psychological shift taking place in the country as Canadians started to reward journalists who took the time to share the real truth about the Freedom Convoy rather than those who did the bidding of the government. This was an attitude of defiance that is growing into an increasingly powerful force in Canada. Even in the face of countless smears by the Trudeau government and the establishment media, millions of Canadians refuse to give in. People realize that there are things more important than being polite or humble, and that an attack on our rights and freedoms was a time for strength and outspokenness rather than submission. And as much as the federal government and provincial governments at the time tried to claim otherwise, the Freedom Convoy did immediately get results. Multiple Canadian provinces either fully lifted or began to ease restrictions shortly after the convoy began to garner national and international attention. And Canadians will not soon forget the use and the abuse of the Emergencies Act. It forever stamped in our minds what the misuse of government power looks like. The psychological revolution also manifested itself most prominently in the Freedom Convoy, but then has also led to massive changes in Canadian politics. The upper echelon of the Conservative Party proved unable to stem the tide of resistance to draconian government policies and was forcefully remolded into an organization that more accurately represented their core supporters. Instead of top-down leadership influencing Canadians, grassroots leadership influenced change at the top. This accelerated the ouster of Erin O'Toole and helped to precipitate the CPC leadership race that led to the election of Pierre Poilievre. At a time when the establishment media was going all in trying to demonize the Freedom Convoy, Pierre Poilievre took a different stance. He made it clear that individual acts of lawlessness were of course unacceptable, but that the Freedom Convoy also represented a wide swath of Canadians who had entirely legitimate concerns about the assault on our rights and freedoms. That early stance gave Poilievre the credibility to build a campaign on the theme of freedom. Even as the political power structure attempted to crush his campaign and demonize him and his supporters the same way they demonized the Freedom Convoy, Poilievre attracted massive crowds, signed up legions of new members, and brought in a significant amount of contributions. This then culminated in Poilievre winning more votes than anyone ever has in a Canadian party leadership contest. And the meaning of this really cannot be overstated. The psychological shift that began quietly in the minds of millions of Canadians then coalesced into the Freedom Convoy and then resisted the full pressure of the political establishment and the media establishment to now generate itself as one of the strongest political forces in our nation. This has set the stage for an election campaign that will provide the clearest choice and contrast that we've seen in a very long time. The ideological differences between the Liberal NDP Socialist Coalition and the Conservative Party, now led by Pierre Poilievre, are incredibly stark. Because of the underlying psychological shift, the political battle in Canada is now truly a battle for the soul of our country. And while the usual differences in economic policy are certainly part of it, the true divide now goes much deeper. The Liberal NDP coalition firmly believes that the size and the power of government should continually be expanded. They view individual rights and freedoms as harmful and dangerous. They believe the heritage and the history of Canada should be denounced and then erased. They believe weakness and victimhood should be exalted. They believe fear should be exploited to give more power to the state. And they believe that those who disagree should simply be silenced. None of that is compatible with the values and the principles that built Canada. And none of that is compatible with being able to restore Canada's freedoms. So from a high-level perspective, the first step, of course, towards the restoration of Canada's freedoms is to ensure that the Liberal NDP coalition is defeated. But we already knew that. The real question is how to ensure that happens. Now, I believe it will require ongoing strength and resolve, because as I said at the outset, the path forward will not be easy. Because they're so obsessed with controlling others, socialists like Justin Trudeau and his ideological cohorts are constantly campaigning, and they're constantly using government power to expand their propaganda apparatus. They also seek to subvert and co-opt once independent institutions. Just look at how much of the establishment media is now indistinguishable from the Prime Minister's public relations apparatus. That control of the media means that every single day, moment after moment, many Canadians are subjected to a very narrow ideological worldview that is ceaselessly repeated. We're seeing that again now, as the new Conservative leader and his supporters are relentlessly demonized. We have to remember that for those like Justin Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh, and many in the establishment media, and all the people who are currently in power in Canada, there's really nothing wrong in Canada right now. Things are going great for them. They have access to a vast amount of taxpayer dollars. They're insulated from the surging cost of living. The system works well for them, so they really couldn't care less that it doesn't work for the rest of us. As a result, any person and any movement that seeks to truly address Canada's problems is a real threat to their power. And this is an essential point. The current political and media establishment are well aware that a revolution is taking place in the minds of millions of Canadians. That's why they continue to fearmonger about the Freedom Convoy. That's why they used an endless stream of lies to first justify the Emergencies Act, and now why they lie and continue to lie about the justification after the fact. Those who've been in power in Canada are still used to Canadians meekly submitting to them. And the fact that more and more Canadians are rejecting that submissive attitude makes politicians like Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh incredibly angry. It also, of course, deeply angers the establishment media, who are used to simply being trusted and believed, yet now have to actually earn that trust, something they're profoundly failing to do. Now, whenever any institution or nation begins a process of profound change, as Canada is experiencing now, whenever there's an awakening of consciousness among those who were once asleep, there is an inevitable backlash from those who benefit from the status quo. They will lash out, they'll blame the other for causing tension or creating chaos. Everything was fine before, they'll say. What's the problem now? Why can't you just go back to being quiet and submissive? Yet all the rage and aggression of those in power doesn't make them right. And a return to submissiveness would only return Canada to a previous position that was deeply unhealthy and unsustainable. After all, if things were working just fine in Canada before, there wouldn't have been a revolution in the mindset of millions of Canadians, as there would have been no need for it. And this is what we're seeing as the government and the establishment media lash out. They complain about divisiveness and anger and rage without ever acknowledging how they fed into the conditions that have caused it and how they continue feeding into it. And so we have to prepare ourselves. What we're going to see, and indeed what we're already seeing in the first week or so of Pierre Poilievre as conservative leader, is a relentless attempt by the current political power structure, the Liberal NDP coalition and the media, to try and undo the psychological change that has taken place in Canada and try to push Canadians back into the box of submissiveness. If the shift in the country is reversed, then restoring Canada's freedoms will be impossible. And so we have to understand how this process is going to play out and how we have to respond. To start with, as we already see, supporters of the new CPC leader will be denounced as extremists. There will be an attempt to separate them from the broader mass of the Canadian people in the minds of millions of Canadians. We should expect to see more language that explicitly contrasts conservatives and Canadians, which is an attempt to turn opponents of the government into a supposedly dangerous other who can then be targeted by draconian state power. At the same time, we will see and increasingly hear that the establishment press is the only institution that can save Canadian democracy from the supposed rising tide of extremism. They'll, of course, never look at or talk about far-left extremism. It'll always just be a one-sided conversation. Then they're going to state that the media is so important to the country that it needs to be insulated from market pressure and protected from competition. All of this ends up with them demanding more taxpayer money and more online censorship. It's obviously no coincidence that all of this lines up with the financial interests of the establishment media, but of course, they will never frame it that way. The damage this can do and is doing is immense, as the media is locking themselves into a destructive downward spiral. In order to try and improve their own financial situation, the establishment media is making itself more and more dependent on the government. The more they do this, the more Canadians lose trust in them, and the more their financial situation worsens. The more Canadians lose trust in them, the more the establishment media must then demonize a wider and wider swath of the country while appealing for even more government power. For example, have you noticed how the category of far-right extremists just keeps on expanding? In a very short time, the establishment press has gone from talking about a small number of extremists to now attempting to lump the entire political opposition in that category. They do so without evidence, but of course that is immaterial to them. It is now in their financial interest for right-wing extremism to be a massive threat, so they will do everything they can to make Canadians think it is. Now, this was most obviously shown when the media downplayed the real anti-Semitic hiring scandal in the Liberal government. Had this occurred under a Conservative government, it would still be the top story. Dozens of officials would have been forced to resign. The Conservatives would have been labeled by every establishment press outlet as dangerous and far right. But when it happened under the Liberals, who the media of course counts on for all their taxpayer money, the media gladly accepted the pathetically weak explanations of the government, and they just sought to quickly move on. Now, I really want everyone here to think about this for a moment, because we can become so used to this pattern that we're almost blind to it. As the media spent months and months attempting to conjure up a far-right menace in the Conservative Party, the Liberal government used our tax dollars to hire someone who has made multiple horrendous anti-Semitic comments. Afterwards, many Jewish Liberal MPs had to almost publicly beg the upper echelons of the Trudeau government to take action. And we can see that anti-Semitism is indeed rampant on the far left, and many in the Liberal NDP coalition were clearly fine looking the other way. So the biggest example of a powerful institution in Canada supporting extremism over the past 2 years has been the Liberal government itself. But the same media personalities who downplay anti-Semitism and other real examples of hatred are the ones who still feel entitled to insult all of us, take our money through government force when we don't freely choose to consume their content, and push the government to silence our perspectives. At this point, you've certainly noted that there's really little to no distance between the agenda of the established media and the agenda of the Liberal NDP coalition. They are now fully codependent. And they both show during the pandemic that they're willing to dehumanize their opponents in order to gain and retain power. So how do we overcome this? How do we win this battle? And why do we have reason to hope? To start, we can take a lot of solace in the fact that there's even a battle at all. Too many Canadians have refused to be weak and submissive for the media and the Liberal NDP coalition to impose their agenda without resistance. The psychological shift that has taken place in Canada is not going away, and it is a key source of political power and energy. If that wasn't the case, the establishment wouldn't still be trying to demonize it to this day. So in order to win the upcoming battle and the upcoming fights, strength and resolve is essential. What I mean by this is that we have to refuse to play the game that the Liberal NDP coalition and establishment press wants us to play. This is a battle of persuasion, to persuade the millions of Canadians who feel that something is deeply wrong, yet are still unsure about who they can trust to put things right. It's impossible to win a battle of persuasion if you're constantly on the defensive. That is what the endless accusations of supposed racism and extremism are meant to do. It is meant to sap the energy of those who demand change and redirect that energy in a way that serves those who are currently in power. Every moment that is spent in a guilt-based, shame-based, defensive posture is a moment that isn't spent talking about how our economy is being wrecked, how our rights are being eroded, and how the free and peaceful Canada we cherish is being lost. In that regard, we can be hopeful because we've already seen the power of avoiding distractions and remaining true to our beliefs. Look at how rapidly public opinion shifted on vaccine mandates and travel restrictions after the Freedom Convoy. Millions of Canadians started to see that they weren't alone and that they could speak out, and the attitudes of the country started to rapidly change. Canadians saw people of all backgrounds, people of all faiths, and people of all social stations who simply had enough of the increasingly anti-Canadian authoritarian actions of the federal government. The lesson here is to never internalize what the establishment media says or thinks about us. The establishment doesn't spend their time worrying about what you think of them, so why should you worry what they think of you? Instead, we just need to bypass them entirely. We must recognize that in today's world, you have tremendous potential power and influence. Simply by being a Canadian, by being someone with a stake in the future of this country, and by being someone who has a story and a perspective to share, you can be more influential than any member of the decaying establishment press. This is what they fear the most, us recognizing our own potential power and our strength. Denying that strength and suppressing that power has been the whole idea behind the guilt-ridden presentation of Canadian history, behind the accusations of racism and extremism, and behind the demands for giving your money and your freedom over to politicians who claim to know better what to do with it than you do. We must have the strength and the courage to reject all of that. If what the establishment fears most is us recognizing our own power, then recognizing our own power is exactly what we have to do. Canada is a nation with truly unlimited potential. And if we can overcome those who seek to rule over us rather than serve us, if we can overcome those who remain locked in a fear-based mindset, then we can win the battle to restore our freedoms. And if we can do that, we have every reason to believe that Canada's best days lie ahead of us. Thank you.
Hi, can people hear me? Yep. Thank you, Spencer. That was wonderful, wonderful exposition. And you've spoken to so many of us about the truths we are thinking about, and many people don't express publicly. So such a great presentation, and it is recorded for those who want to see it later on. Now let's move to a question and answer session. The chat box is open for anyone who wants to enter their question for Spencer. Simply write it in. I'll see it here, and the co-host will see it, and then we'll present those questions to Spencer. And then afterwards, if we have a fairly good response, we'll go to an open mic situation. So I'll give you a couple minutes, but I would like, as always, I would like to ask Spencer a question, because I was thinking about everything you're saying so intensely. Do you see what's happening in Canada? I mean, we are mostly concerned with ourselves, right? With our freedoms and the imposition of our freedoms, and the reality that we know and that they simply deny. I mean, one of their biggest sort of tactics is to say it doesn't exist. Cancel culture doesn't exist, wokeism doesn't exist, and so on and so forth.
It doesn't exist, but that it's good that it exists, right? It goes from one to the other.
Exactly.
This doesn't exist. You notice it. Oh, it's a good thing, and you're
it's a good
hateful
thing
for opposing it.
You should be grateful for it. But actually, I'm thinking in terms of a worldwide movement. Like I just noticed in the news, I don't know whether you saw this or not, that in Sweden, there's a center-right coalition that has seized power. That, for me in my lifetime, that is unprecedented, and I'm 67. I never thought that I would ever see Sweden. I mean, I'm delighted to see it, but I never thought that I would ever see Sweden move in this direction, right? So the interesting, do you see this as part of a worldwide movement that a lot of Canadians are just not aware of, or what are your feelings on that?
I think to an extent. I mean, I think, political parties in different countries are different. The issues are different. But I think the underlying similarity is that people are kind of rebelling against the idea that you can't talk about certain things, right? And that's what happened in Sweden. They had a big increase in immigration, which coincided with an increase in crime. And you just couldn't talk about that. It was just, you don't talk about that. You can't say that. If you say anything, you're racist or you get attacked. And I think people just had enough of that. They said, look, we're supposed to be a free country. You're allowed to talk about what's happening. You're allowed to elect people who say they're going to address what's happening. And so I think to an extent, it was something similar in Canada. Where, I think, for me, I think really the tipping point was the rally in front of Parliament Hill, where Trudeau, early on in the pandemic, where Trudeau, went and took a knee, and a bunch of politicians went and took a knee. And then you saw public health experts, and I can't believe they said it with a straight face, but they started saying things like, well, racism is also a health hazard and is also a pandemic. And it's okay, so wait a minute, like you're allowed to destroy thousands of businesses, tell people they don't get to see their families, can't go to funerals, but this politically correct protest happens and we're just going to put the science on hold for today. And then they explicitly said, but this shouldn't be taken as support for other protests. Okay, well, it's obviously not about science, then it's all about politics. So I think to an extent, what unites a lot of these things we're seeing is people just saying, you know what, we're allowed to talk about what we want to talk about. In a free country, the government and the media doesn't get to say that this topic is off limits. And so I think that's a good thing. The whole idea of freedom is that we're supposed to be able to compete with different ideas and worldviews and see which one wins. And that competition can't happen if people are silenced.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You speak for so many of us. Let's go to some of the questions that are coming up in the chat box. I think Richard says, how can we tackle the increased divisiveness in Canada regarding gender, race, energy, etc.? i.e., how do we reestablish conversations about the conservative perspective?
Yeah, well, I think social media is a great tool for that. It's interesting to watch, governments in the media try to push the same perspective and then be shocked at the result. I mean, a good example is something that happened today. The city of Toronto put out an ad And it was like a girl sitting with her mother, looking outside, very sad and forlorn, seeing a bunch of other kids playing. And then the girl says to her mother, "Oh, can I go outside and play?" And the mother says, "Oh no, there's still a pandemic happening." And then it says, "Get vaccinated, like get your kids vaccinated." And people hated that. They said, "Look, kids are outside playing all the time right now. You can't, the city shouldn't be telling them you don't get to do that unless you're vaccinated." And so the city of Toronto, they took it down. They got such a backlash. So, when I talk about kind of not internalizing what, the media or different people say, I think what's happened is they're so used to just throwing an accusation at somebody and then that person just going away, right? So someone says something, "Oh, you're far right," or, religious extremist, or, you're a bigot or you're a racist. And, when you just ignore it, the average person is not going to be swayed by that, but it's almost kind of like if you look guilty, people will think you're guilty, right? Like if you internalize that feeling, then people will start to think, "Oh, well, this person must have something to be guilty about," right? So I think, and, Pierre Poilievre did that very well in the campaign. They threw all that kind of stuff at him, racist, bigot, whatever. And he mostly just ignored it. He didn't respond to the media. He just held his campaign events and it worked out quite well for him. So I think the other thing is to understand that independent media really has changed things. It's not the media, the traditional media, and governments don't have the same power to just put out a dishonest narrative and then have there be no resistance to it. And the Freedom Convoy was a good example. I mean, the government was saying, "Oh, these are all racist and far right extremists." But Canadians were looking on social media and seeing people getting hundreds of thousands of views on videos, just walking through the crowd and talking to people. So, when the media is saying one thing and people are literally looking at a video of a bunch of different people in a crowd, just saying they're tired of authoritarian government actions, then they're going to believe what they see with their own eyes, not what someone in the media is telling them. So I think that's also important, is just getting the message out there yourself.
So in other words, it's a case of they were saying, "Don't believe your lying eyes, believe us."
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Could you, this is from Mike, our chairman. Could you speak to the role of education both positively and negatively in the present crisis and moving forward? I'd like to address that question too, because
Mhm.
I was a professional teacher, right, for 28 years. So education is key, right? So I'm interested in hearing your perspectives on that. So the role of education.
Yeah, well, I think one, there needs to be more freedom in education. By that, parents should be able to more easily opt out of the public system and take their money to a private school if they want to. The idea that the government controls the schooling to the extent it does, there's no reason it has to be that way. That's just kind of how it's turned out in the country. And doesn't need to be the case. I think also there needs to be, more of a closer look at some of the people who are becoming teachers. And I don't like the idea of any kind of, like inquisition or anything like that. But, we obviously know the situation in Ontario, the well-endowed, unique individual who's teaching students. And, I want to be reasonable in how I say it, but at a certain point, you have to say there's some people who are just going through mental health struggles. And is that necessarily acceptable for them to go through that in front of children? I don't think so. That's not really what children go to school for. So I think in those specific cases, there needs to be just, as we say, common sense. The average person looks at that and says, "That's not appropriate." They don't need to go through some deep political discussion or philosophical discussion. People say, "No, person can do what they want at home, but not in front of kids like that." So I think that's part of it. But the other thing is, to look at the point I made about the left constantly campaigning is they don't look at elections as the end, right? For them, it's just the beginning. And so conservatives, I think, understandably, sometimes look and say, "Oh, well, we won an election, so see you in 4 years." And the left is like, "Okay, we lost an election. We're going to be running for every school board seat. We're going to be running for every city council seat, mayoral seat, every little part of the government that influences power in any subtle way." And so, conservatives kind of wake up in 4 years like, "Well, the country's way more left wing than it was 4 years ago. I thought we just won a federal election. What's going on?" And so there kind of needs to be an emulation in a way of what the left does, just in terms of constantly campaigning and really understanding, the way the government is structured and getting involved. But also in terms of education, we need to start teaching more patriotism to young people. How does anyone think that you can teach a whole generation that their country's terrible and then that's not going to be a huge problem? How do you get someone to sign up for the military to defend a country? I mean, our military is struggling severely right now. How do you get people to defend the country or support the country if you just told them it's evil? And then you also can't confront real evil. I mean, you see how difficult it is for many politicians, especially in the Liberal government, to ever really condemn China. They'll say, oh, well, Canada's done some bad things too. Well, you could have made that argument at any time in history. You could have said, oh, well, we can't condemn what Germany or Stalin's doing because Canada did some bad. Having done some bad things in the past for a country doesn't mean that the country hasn't changed since then. And it doesn't mean you can't confront evil in the present. And so I think there needs to be a real look at, being proud of the country, certainly acknowledging mistakes and not pretending nothing bad has ever happened. But there's a lot to be proud of. I mean, people come here from around the world. Western civilization just objectively has built the best societies, the strongest economies, the freest countries in the world. And if we just, forget all of that or criticize it, then we're not going to be able to keep that going. And then we're going to lose everything that was built. And people say, oh, what happened? Well, yeah, we destroyed the foundation of our society and then it all fell apart. What a shock. You tear out the foundation of a house and then the house starts to crumble. I don't think people would be surprised.
Yeah, that's very, very true. I think Hal has a question here about an Italian politician. So it sort of dovetails with what I've said about it being a worldwide movement of people rising up, and kind of realizing that the elites that are ruling them don't have their interests at heart, right? This woman's name is Giorgia Meloni. She's 5'2", a firebrand in Italy. I listened to one of her speeches with subtitles. I was very moved by it. So that's part, I think, of the movement that's going on. I think the rest of Hal's question has to do with why do you believe people do not educate themselves on things like the efficacy or non-efficacy of masks against viruses? Why do they just blindly accept it? I think was what the question is.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it does come down to, two factors. One is kind of just the attitude, especially in Canada, more so than many countries of, submission to authority. People feel, oh, it's not nice to push back or fight back. Canadians don't really make a fuss. And so unfortunately, that can be manipulated by government officials who they give you an order and then you follow it, right? That's what they expect. Yeah. The other thing too, I think, is that, and I think you look at the media and the Bank of Canada as well. I think a lot of our institutions are kind of just living off their past success. And this is not just true in Canada, but much of the West. I mean, you look at, say, the era from 1945 to 1990, 2000, give or take, basically an uninterrupted run of success for the Western world, rising GDP, rising, income equality, and not by redistribution, but economies growing quite strongly for the most part. The world was quite peaceful. Wars were generally quick and won by the US or its allies. They were never really big existential problems. So most of our institutions could say, yeah, just don't worry about politics, don't worry about society, just trust us and we'll take care of things. And they largely did. That really hasn't been the case for quite some time. Our institutions have obviously degraded in large part because people stopped paying attention. They felt they could get away with more and more. So I think what's happening now is a slow education of the public in the understanding that, it's not anti-democratic to question our institutions. It's in fact extremely democratic to do so. They're supposed to work for us. So if you can't question them, then you can't call yourself a free country. So I think that's a big part of it. I mean, again, Poilievre, the way he talked about the Bank of Canada, I think that was good because it at least sent a message that these institutions are not somehow above everybody. How can you as the Bank of Canada governor, having one job, get your job wrong over and over and over? I mean, that's his job, is to predict inflation. And he kept saying, oh, sorry, we made mistakes, we got it wrong. Okay, I mean, some random person can get it wrong on monetary policy, but not the head of the Bank of Canada. So I think you're slowly starting to see people understand that institutions have to be questioned. And that will lead to a process of change and renewal. And those institutions will become, I think, more functional in the future. And then the cycle might end up just repeating itself. We'll have another 30, 40 years of success, and then people will forget and we'll have to be reminded again. So we'll see.
Yeah, we haven't had a lot of domestic crises in the sense of like a war or something like that threatening us. I mean, as you say, we've won most of the conflicts, right? I think maybe conservatives won elections, but they didn't always win the culture war, which was going on underneath the surface of things. Okay, the next question is, what do you think Pierre Poilievre will do with the CBC, as well as funding flowing to legacy media generally, should he become the next PM? I know what I want, but well, let's see what you have to say about that. What do you think he'll do with the CBC, and what do you think he'll do with the bias of the legacy media? incredible bias.
Yeah, I think he'll definitely cut CBC's funding. Whether it completely goes away, I don't know if that will happen. I think it's interesting. You see politicians, especially in the Conservative Party, but generally, they always kind of distinguish between Radio Canada and CBC, right? It's kind of a different thing in Quebec. So I would expect to see maybe they hand that off more to the Quebec government, where they don't touch that as much because it's kind of more of a touchstone there. But I think, he seems like a person of his word so far, as much as a politician can be. Saying you expect any politician to keep every promise is probably a little naive. The other thing too, though, is he, unlike Aaron O'Toole, Poilievre won so decisively on a certain message, and he saw what happened to Aaron. Like he's only there because, I shouldn't say only, but he's there because Aaron O'Toole broke his promises. Aaron O'Toole campaigned is one thing, and then tried to act and govern is something else. And so I think Poilievre knows that if he tries the same thing will happen to him, right? Someone else, he's going to be replaced. I think he's a better communicator than O'Toole also. He's a better speaker, understands people better. So I don't see that being a problem. I think with the overall legacy media, I think he'll cut their funding as well. And I think that's easier politically. And there'll be some political blowback against CBC, cutting CBC in some parts of the country. Bailout to private media, though, I don't think you don't see many people in this country who either think that's acceptable or either pay attention and care much about it. So that won't be a problem. But I think because he campaigned so explicitly as a certain type of politician, he basically has no choice but to keep those promises. And I don't think he wants to get out of those promises either. If you look at, he's been pretty consistent ideologically for quite a long time, back to when he was either high school or university, limited government, individual freedom, get the state out of most things it's doing. And so it's not like O'Toole, who kind of put on a costume to win a leadership race and then went back to his old self, and people didn't really like that. Poilievre is kind of being who he always has been. So I just think it's different for him. I think he'll stick to most of what he says.
Thanks. There aren't any more questions in the lineup, so I would encourage people, if you do have a question, to put in the chat box. But I kind of have a question for you before people do enter their questions. And that's about the incredible success of wokeism. You mentioned the teacher in Ontario with the prosthetic breasts, the kinds of things that are being taught in schools and accepted in corporations, government, the full panoply of wokeism and the ridiculous assumptions that wokeism has, just the anti-realism or anti-world as it is kind of assumptions. So what do you think led to that? Because, even 15, 20 years ago, some of the things that are being enforced in policy or people are beginning to accept would be considered ridiculously idiotic. Right? So how did the wokesters get to this level? And how do they have so much control over things?
I think it's a few things. I think one is, there was kind of a battle a while ago between, good.
Oh, it's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's kind of a battle between, social conservatives and then the left over whether there should be a line drawn in certain places. And what ended up happening is the change shifted from should there be a line here or there to should there be a line at all? And people who kind of thought there should be no line anywhere ended up winning. And so you kind of see where that leads, right? It's if everyone's gender identity is completely protected, then a teacher is allowed to wear, fake prosthetic breasts and no one can say anything about it, or else you're, evil transphobe or something. And so what I think you're going to see is people saying, okay, well, there has to be a line somewhere. We have to go back to drawing a line. And I think you're going to start seeing more people say that. I think the other thing, the reason it happened is the lack of existential problems. The human brain is very much a problem-solving machine. And as much as we intellectually know that we're in a modern society, the brain at certain instinctual levels is not aware of that. It still thinks, okay, you got to find a problem and solve it. And so when there's not a real problem, when we all have, most of us have homes, when the economy is doing pretty well, when there's no real external threats, or at least perceived external threats, the brain still looks for a problem. And so it became our whole foundation of our society is, racist or evil, where everyone's bigoted. And so a new problem was created, and the woke group just kept coming up with problems and kind of triggering that in people's brains. Like, oh, here's something we need to fix. I think with war, Russia, going to war against Ukraine, with the energy crisis, with the inflation, economic challenges, you're going to start seeing people saying, okay, here are some actual real problems to address. We don't have time for all this woke nonsense already. Look at Germany. they had to basically admit, yeah, all the hundreds of billions we spent on the big green energy shift, that was kind of a huge mistake because we're desperately searching for all kinds of energy. And so, I just think, I think the fact that the world is a more dangerous place now is going to start putting some people back into a more serious mindset. And there won't be the time for a lot of the woke stuff. And so it'll happen slowly, but I think you're starting to see people say, let's have some serious people in charge for a change.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll go to open mic, folks. So if you want to ask Spencer a question, please use the hand icon at the bottom of your screen. It's probably in the reactions section if you want to use that, or perhaps it's at the top of your screen. I don't know what kind of computer you have. But let's go to people asking questions directly. And the first question is Lawrence. So let's see. Just gonna go through the technical aspect of things here. Hold on. So I'm gonna click on Lawrence here. Hold on a minute, folks, please.
There he is. Can't hear you. No.
No, we can't hear you, Lawrence. Can you demute? You might be muted. No, it can't be heard. Okay. Okay, while Lawrence struggles with that, we'll go to Petrushka. Okay, go ahead. Jackie,
Sorry,
can you?
Yep, you'll hear, oh, am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're unmuted. Yeah, you can go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, you may hear my dog barking, but thank you so much, Spencer. This has been really good. I'm concerned about the situation in Ontario with the male teacher who's gone back to his industrial ed class, being a woman. And I've seen pictures and it's just disgusting. And I think in our bend over backwards culture to be tolerant, where are children? Where are children's rights? What does the woke culture think of children? I'm so concerned about this because it seems the individual, this man who is out there somewhere, he is causing such distress to people and especially to children. What is the law that protects children?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the laws are, quite screwed up in many ways in this country. And so the teacher is apparently protected under gender expression in Ontario, the Human Rights Code there. What's interesting is this is in some ways reminds me of the strange attitude during the pandemic when anyone would bring up, harm to children from different government policies. And then all the public officials would say, oh, well, children are resilient. Well, I thought adults were supposed to be resilient and kind of protect children. It's very weird the reversal is taking place. So, now you see the similar thing. Oh, all the kids can handle it. I don't think anyone cares what that person does in their own, free time. But that's it's a public institution. There used to be dress codes in school, let alone letting people wear whatever that guy's wearing. And so, I think as I said, there needs to be a line drawn somewhere. I think politicians are understandably afraid to talk about it because the media will, of course, lump them in as, a transphobe or whatever term is used these days. But I think this is kind of a tipping point moment because it's just so visually absurd to people. it's just so difficult to make some sort of case for why, oh, this is totally fine, this is totally normal. No one's going to look at that and think that's normal for a teacher. And so I think, if it's handled carefully, not in terms of trying to demonize that person or direct hate towards them, but just saying, look, this is not acceptable in a classroom. That's not acceptable. And I think the average person will agree with that. And so I think that creates the opportunity to start shifting some minds and saying, look, there needs to be some line drawn here. And the line should be somewhere before allowing that to happen.
Is there something that you would recommend? Like through Campaign Life, I signed a petition today, but what do you recommend?
Yeah, I think contacting conservative MPs and probably Ontario PC MPPs as well. They'd be the ones who'd be most influenceable on it because they require the support from, I think, many of the people who'd be most outraged. And so, just like with a lot of other issues, they just need to be pressured repeatedly and, respectfully, of course, but told that people aren't okay with this and that you expect them to speak up. And then, it's like with the Freedom Convoy and the Conservative Party opposing restrictions. It started very slowly at first. One or two MPs kind of said a little something and then they got punished. And then one or two more said something. And then it just kind of started to build. And then the party very rapidly shifted towards being completely against a lot of restrictions. So I think putting similar kinds of pressure on politicians to speak out about what's happening in that classroom, I think is a good place to start.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Welcome.
Thanks, Pat. And yeah, I agree with you entirely in this regard, right? It's the people who make the decision. They don't know that they have this power, but it is the people. I think Havjik wrote a book called The Power of the Powerless, right? About how if people rise up, there's nothing much that authority figures in elite authority figures can do if the people definitively say we're not going to take this, right? So I think that was an excellent answer. There's one more question here from MG. How did the Liberal NDP coalition get away with such foolish fiscal decisions and policies when it should be clear that they're disastrous?
Yeah, well, they've gotten a lot of help from the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada printing so much money has made it easier for them to kind of pass on the consequences. There are still the same consequences, but they don't look as obvious. This is a point I make about inflation is inflation, it's almost perfectly designed to redirect blame from where it should be directed. So what do people see? And this is Jagmeet Singh obviously takes advantage of this. You go to the store and okay, prices are up, grocery prices are up, I think 10%, the highest since 1981, 1 month jump. And so you go to the store, you see a higher price, you think, oh, well, this stupid, grocery evil capitalists took my money. They're taking advantage of me. But what really happened? Well, what happened is that the value of your money declined, right? It doesn't look like that because you just see a higher price, but what happened is each individual unit of money that you have is now worth less. And that happened because, the government or the Bank of Canada printed a bunch of money because the government made it tougher for people to produce while simultaneously flooding the economy with more debt-fueled money. And so, but none of that looks obvious to people. It looks like it must be the grocery store that did it, not the government. And so Jagmeet Singh goes around saying, oh, grocery store profits are up this year, big capitalists and the conservatives. And he's blaming the conservatives somehow, who haven't been in power since 2015 for inflation. And so, back to the education point, schools need to be teaching this. They need to teach people how inflation works, how the Bank of Canada works. I mean, the Bank of Canada probably exerts more influence over our lives than almost any politician in the country. And yet, do most people know who the governor is? Do most people know how it works? Do most people know how printing money works? No, and the Bank of Canada itself took advantage of that because they put out a series of tweets saying, oh, did we print money during the pandemic? No, we didn't print cash, assuming that, okay, because we didn't print a whole bunch of bills and hand it out to people. They just create money on a computer, right? Most money is digital these days. So they're taking advantage of ignorance, and Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau are glad to play into it. And one thing I really liked about what Pierre Poilievre has been doing is he does take the time to explain these things to people. He talks about sound money, the history of governments, clipping coins, and now it's just printing money, or, putting more money digitally into the economy. And that's kind of an essential education process that needs to take place. And so I think that's a good first step, but certainly the education system needs to improve dramatically, because if you have people here who think that inflation is caused by the grocery store, then that's a real problem.
Thanks, Spencer. So Mike, I didn't see your hand. So did you want to ask Spencer a question directly, or was that the last one I gave you? Okay, great. So the next person is, I know, I've got him. It's a team effort here. So the next question is from Hal. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Are you familiar with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms taking the vaccine, the no-fly mandate to court, and that there's supposed to be a ruling coming up? It's been delayed for I think a couple of years now. Is a ruling supposed to be coming up on the 31st? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not extremely well versed in that. I mean, obviously support them taking that to court and hope it's struck down. But I do think, a deeper point is, you look at the Supreme Court of Canada. Most Canadians can probably tell you more about the American Supreme Court than the Canadian Supreme Court, more about American courts than Canadian ones. And we saw how much attention the Roe versus Wade decision in the States got in Canada. And well, interesting. Maybe we should talk about Canadian issues in our own country. But I think that's a deeper issue. Is we hear all the time that the judiciary in Canada is non-political. It's really just mostly monolithically liberal, and that it's such a monolith that you don't even notice politics. Oh, they're all pretty similar. They all make similar rulings. Of course they do, because there's basically one ideology there. So in a strange way, conservatives almost need to increasingly politicize the judicial system. And I think a good place to kind of start with that is with crime. I think Canadians are looking across the country and seeing some of these just shockingly weak, punishments for horrific crimes. We saw obviously the guy who killed so many people in Saskatchewan. I think it was 59 prior convictions, somewhere between 50 and 60 prior convictions. And so how can someone like that be, out and not in jail, right? And then the parole system let him out as well, right? They said, oh, he's a low risk to the public. Well, he killed, more than 10 people. So I think starting to have that conversation, and a lot of this, unfortunately does come down to how much courage the Conservative Party has, because the NDP obviously are basically a joke. The Liberals are happy with everything the way it goes now, so they're not going to change anything. And so a lot comes down to, the Conservative Party. And I hope that will start to change. And I think we need to pressure them to talk about those issues. But it's been a really weird trend in this country, because you'll look at polls and you'll say, half of Canadians want, say, lower immigration levels, or half of Canadians want the death penalty returned. And then just nobody talks about those things. It's like somehow half the country is basically just ignored on issues where it doesn't go the way the establishment wants it to go. So I think, back to the point at the start, is there something happening around the world? It's that people are starting to talk about issues they've been told they can't talk about. So I hope that judicial case will go well. And if it doesn't, then I think we just need to have more of a conversation about really politicizing the judiciary in this country. And, judges should have to, kind of account for what kind of rulings they're going to make and what their ideology is, because just pretending they're all, nonpartisan, and then they go in and they all act like liberals for the most part, it's not working out too well.
Thanks, Hal, for your question, and thanks, Spencer, for your answer. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about before. I read an article on what happened in Sweden and the shift there politically. And basically, it's because people couldn't take it anymore, and they couldn't, they couldn't subdue it anymore. So it just came out in this political decision that's there. So perhaps we'll see similar radical shifts in Canada. Okay. I'm just going to check here and see, and I don't see anybody having another question. No hands are up, and no hands are in the chat box. No, nothing is in the chat box that I can see. So I think we might have come to the end of tonight, and it's 8:07. I just want to thank you so much, Spencer, for the presentation. Outstanding. I still remember the presentation you gave to us here in Duncan. At the Duncan Meadows Country Club, and the power of what you said. That is on video on our website, by the way. If anybody wants to go back and see what Spencer told us in those days, I think it was 2017 or 18, but very powerful speech and very powerful conclusion. So we'll turn it back over to Mike. So we can close tonight. So thanks, and thanks to everybody from me personally who showed up today. So go ahead, Mike.
All right, thanks so much, Perry, for moderating. It's always much appreciated. I appreciate your skill in that. It's a wonderful thing. And Spencer, thank you so much for your insight. I appreciate this. try to fathom the hard work and the study and the effort that you put into the work that you do. And it is much appreciated by myself and many others. I'm sure you have a good following. We trust that that will continue to grow as more and more people turn to saner voices, of which you are one. So thank you so much for your presentation. I do trust that we will take to heart the idea of being courageous people and taking a stand. And as you say, if we understand that we have power in terms of our own stories, in terms of our own experiences of life as a Canadian, that is something that stands against all the insanity that swirls around us. So as we stand together, we become much more of a force to be reckoned with. So thank you for those positive, encouraging comments as well. And also thank you for everyone else for participating tonight. We appreciate you coming out for this evening, or actually staying in is what you did this time. But thanks for participating. And Lord, I would ask you also to check out our Freedom Defense Canada website, read it and leave comments on the articles that are there. Go to Facebook and check our posts, like and comment if you can. All these activities help us in our presence in the digital world for people to recognize who we are and continue to join together with other like-minded Canadians as we continually work in this cultural battle. And finally, please encourage those you know around you to join FDC, and also feel free to donate to FDC, as all of this helps us to grow and continue the important work. So we'll keep you posted for our next event, whether it be online or a live event, we'll let you know. And so finally, with all that said, from all of us at Freedom Defense Canada, we thank you and we wish you all a good evening. So good night and thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Spencer.
Thank you, Spencer.